Mediterranean, pressed his palms against the cold walls until his skin turned white. His voice cracked as he muttered again and again, "Varus, give me back my legions." The cry echoed through the palace, traveling down the columns like a curse no priest could lift. For Rome, the disaster was not measured in the corpses of 20,000 men rotting beneath the German pines. It was measured in shame. 3 legions, Rome's finest, had been swallowed by the forest, betrayed by a man they had once called brother, Arminius, the German who wore a Roman sword until he turned it against them. That wound festered. On the streets of Rome, whispers spread like plague. If the legions could be broken in Germania, where else could they fall? Mothers lit lamps for sons who would never return. Senators debated in hushed voices, afraid the city itself might tremble at the thought that Rome, the eternal, unshakable Rome, had been humbled by tribes they once dismissed as savages. But the frontier burned hotter than the Senate. Along the Rhine, soldiers sharpened blades with a fury that no order could temper. Centurions spat curses into the wind, vowing blood for blood. They remembered the stories told by survivors, comrades butchered in swamps, eagles torn from Roman standards, men crucified in ways no civilized tongue dared describe. These were not wounds of the flesh. These were scars on pride. And then came the boy who carried that fire in his veins. Germanicus, adopted son of Tiberius, nephew of Augustus, soldier before he was a man. He walked the camps with the restless energy of someone who had inherited not just command, but a blood debt. Soldiers cheered when he passed, not because of his name, but because they saw something dangerous in his eyes. Hunger. Not for land, not for gold, but for vengeance. To the legions, he was not a commander. He was the embodiment of the promise that Rome would not forget. On the other side of the forests, far from marble and torchlight, Arminius stood beneath the ancient oaks. The forest was his temple, the soil his altar. He had fought under Roman banners once, learned their drills, memorized the rhythm of their marching songs. And then he had turned that knowledge into a blade to gut them from within. To his tribes, he was no longer just a chieftain. He was the liberator who had shown that the empire could bleed. Between them lay Germania, endless forests that swallowed sunlight, rivers that drowned armies, and swamps that clung like chains to every Roman boot. Here, the land itself seemed to side with its children. No wall, no road, no stone had been laid by Roman hand without resistance. And so the stage was set. It was not just a war of men, but of memory. One side sought revenge for humiliation. The other sought freedom from empire. In Rome's halls, shame whispered of weakness. In Germania's forests, victory tasted like hope. The world waited for the next clash, as if history itself held its breath. But fate does not wait. Dawn broke over the Rhine like a blade being drawn from its sheath. The mist curled above the water, muffling the sounds of armor being strapped and swords sliding into scabbards. The Roman legions prepared to march, not for conquest, not for glory, but for redemption. Every man carried the weight of Teutoburg on his shoulders. Every shield bore the memory of the fallen. The trumpets sounded, and a tide of red crested against the horizon. For legions began their march into the green abyss of Germania. And in the distance, unseen yet waiting, the horn of Arminius would answer. The forest did not welcome them. It swallowed the legions whole. Columns of men stretched for miles, a red serpent threading through the damp lungs of Germania. The air was heavy, wet with mist that clung to every bronze helmet and made the iron rims of shields sweat with dew. Boots sank into black earth. The steady beat of marching feet echoed against trunks older than Rome itself, as if the forest mocked their discipline with its silence. Germanicus rode at the front, helm tucked beneath one arm, his face lit by the pale light of a reluctant sun. He had the bearing of a man too young to wear the scars of command, but too determined to admit it. Every step forward was a step into his uncle's shadow. Tiberius had ordered him to punish the tribes, to restore honor. But Germanicus knew the truth. This was not strategy. This was theater. Rome demanded a spectacle of vengeance, and he was the actor chosen to bleed for applause. Behind him, the soldiers muttered, though never loud enough to draw a centurion's lash. Some spoke of ghosts, comrades lost in the Teutoburg, their bones gnawed by wolves, their souls still screaming in the soil. Others whispered the name of Arminius with a mixture of hatred and awe. To the legions, he was both traitor and phantom, a man who had worn Roman armor, spoken Latin like a brother, then led them into a massacre so complete it still haunted their dreams. "Keep the line tight," barked a centurion, his voice gravel dragged across stone. The forest listens. And indeed it felt alive. Every rustle in the undergrowth made soldiers clutch their pilum tighter. Every crow overhead sounded like an omen. Even the engineers, normally loud with curses as they hacked at trees to build paths and bridges, worked in uneasy silence. The legion's greatest strength, order, was being tested by a land that thrived on chaos. Yet Germanicus pressed forward. His heart was a furnace, fueled by the memory of Augustus' despair, of Varus' shame, of the insult Rome had suffered. He could not allow hesitation. In his tent at night, he traced maps by candlelight, the flicker of flame across his eyes revealing the restless hunger within. Germania was not just his battlefield, it was his inheritance. To tame, it was to prove himself worthy of Rome's future. To fail was to join Varus in the graveyard of dishonor. Meanwhile, across the trees and swamps, Arminius prepared in silence. He had the patience of the forest itself. To his warriors, he was no longer merely a chieftain. He was the living echo of their ancestors. He gathered them not with speeches, but with certainty. "The Romans will come," he told them, "because their pride demands it. And pride makes blind men march into graves." Each tribe that joined him brought new blood, new fury. Around firelight, they sang of Teutoburg, their voices rising like the howl of wolves under the moon. They sharpened axes stolen from Roman dead, reforged swords captured from their enemies, and painted themselves with the ash of burned forts. Children listened wide-eyed as elders told them how the forest itself had betrayed the legions before, and would do so again. To the Germans, the land was not an obstacle. It was an ally. Every river had a hidden ford. Every swamp had a path that only their bare feet could cross. Every fallen oak could become a wall. Where Rome saw mud and misery, the tribe saw opportunity. The tension between worlds could not have been sharper. At dusk, when the Romans pitched camp, their squares of earth and ditches carved perfect geometry into the wilderness. Fires burned in measured rows, trumpets sounded in ritual, and sentries paced with practiced discipline. Yet outside those lines of order, in the blackness of the trees, Arminius men watched. They moved like shadows, testing, probing, learning. Each night the forest closed tighter, and each morning the legions awoke to find strange symbols carved into trees, warnings, or perhaps invitations. Some soldiers spat and cursed. Others crossed themselves, muttering prayers to Mars and Jupiter. Even hardened veterans felt the weight of invisible eyes. Germanicus stood at the edge of camp one night, staring into the darkness. The fires of his legion glowed behind him like stars caught in nets, but his gaze was on the void ahead. He could almost feel Arminius there, just beyond reach, waiting. The forest was not silent. It was listening. And the deeper Rome marched, the more it seemed the land itself was preparing to close its jaws. The rain came without warning. It began as a soft drizzle, a whisper against helmets and cloaks, but soon thick drops hammered the columns like stones from the heavens. The neat lines of the march faltered as men adjusted shields to cover their faces, boots sinking deeper into mud that seemed to claw at their ankles. Wagons groaned under the weight of water, wheels shrieking as they sank into the softened road. Germanicus raised his hand, halting the column. His officers gathered, faces streaked with rain, voices low. The plan had been simple. Cross the marshes of Pontes Longi before autumn made the path impassable. But the storm had arrived early, and with it, the first taste of the land's betrayal. "The bridges won't hold if this continues," muttered one centurion, pointing to a wooden span that shuddered with every wagon. Another swore, gesturing to the forest around them. The enemy waits. They always wait in storms. Germanicus listened, but his eyes were fixed on the trees. The rain blurred the world, turning the forest into a moving wall of shadows. For the first time, doubt gnawed at him. Not doubt in his men. They were Rome's steel, but in the land itself. Could discipline fight mud? Could courage outlast a storm? Behind him, soldiers murmured. Not curses this time, but prayers. They remembered the stories of Teutoburg, where rain had drowned their fires and broken their bows, where thunder had masked the Germanic horns until it was too late. And then it happened. The forest fell silent. Every crow, every dripping branch, every distant rustle gone. The only sound was the breathing of thousands of men and the soft groan of wet wood beneath their boots. A silence so heavy it pressed against their chests, making every heartbeat sound like a drum. Germanicus opened his mouth to give an order, but the forest spoke first. A horn. It tore through the mist like the cry of some ancient beast, deep and guttural, echoing off the trees until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The legion froze. Then a second horn answered, and a third, weaving a chorus of doom across the swamp. The ambush had begun. From both sides of the path, javelins rained down, slicing through the fog. Shields rose instinctively, but the narrow road left no room for maneuver. A cart splintered as a spear pierced its axle, throwing men into the mud. Horses reared, their screams mingling with the thunder as arrows hissed through the downpour. "Hold the line!" Germanicus roared, his voice cutting through chaos. He drew his sword, the steel flashing as lightning lit the sky. His officers echoed his command, but already the column was stretching, fraying under the pressure. The Germans did not rush in. They melted from the trees in small groups, striking and vanishing, their bodies painted with mud and ash until they were one with the forest. They attacked not to kill outright, but to disrupt, to cut bridges, to cripple wagons, to slow the march until exhaustion did the killing for them. Germanicus fought to steady his men, riding along the line, splashing through mud as he shouted encouragement. He locked eyes with soldiers who looked ready to break and barked orders until their fear turned into fury. Yet inside, he felt the weight of realization. This was no battlefield Rome could master. This was Arminius' world, and Arminius was watching. High on a ridge beyond the swamp, the Germanic leader stood with his warriors. His face was streaked with rain, his hair plastered to his brow, but his eyes burned with cold fire. He did not need to join the fight. His victory was patience. Every delay, every broken wagon, every drowned soldier. These were offerings to the forest, sacrifices to the freedom he had sworn to protect. The rain thickened, turning the ground into rivers. Roman trumpets blared in confusion, trying to signal order, but their calls were swallowed by thunder and horns. Germanicus ordered a counterattack, heavy infantry charging into the trees, but the enemy melted away, leaving only shadows and the sound of laughter echoing in the mist. And then came the break. A wagon, overloaded with provisions, toppled as the bridge beneath it collapsed. Soldiers rushed to save it, but the narrow span cracked like bone, sending men and supplies crashing into the swamp below. Panic rippled down the line. Soldiers shoved against each other, trying to retreat and advance at once. The Serpent of Rome had been cut in two. For the first time, Germanicus felt fear not as a whisper, but as a roar in his chest. He had led his men into the jaws of the forest, and now the jaws were closing. The battle was no longer about vengeance. It was about survival. The storm did not pass. It deepened. For 3 days the rain turned the marshes of Pontes Longi into a labyrinth of mud and drowned timber. The Roman serpent slithered forward, but each movement was slower, each step heavier, each command harder to hear above the roar of wind and water. The forest seemed to delight in their suffering, swallowing wheels, pulling down horses, and breaking the backs of men already bent from exhaustion. Germanicus had never seen his legions like this. These were men who had faced Parthian arrows, Pannonian rebels, and Illyrian sieges, but here in Germania, they fought ghosts as much as warriors. Their discipline cracked not from fear of the enemy, but from the silence between attacks. Days of marching, of horns that called death from the trees, of shadows darting just beyond reach. It wore down the mind more than the body. One night, by the dim glow of campfires drowned in rain, an old centurion approached him. His voice was low but steady. "General, they are remembering Teutoburg." Germanicus said nothing. The centurion pressed on. "They believe the forest is cursed, that every tree hides a Roman soul, waiting to drag us down." The word stung because Germanicus felt their truth. He had marched his men into the same nightmare that had consumed Varus. And unlike the histories carved into stone, this story was being written in mud and blood beneath his own command. Yet he could not falter. At dawn, he walked among the ranks, drenched to the bone, clasping shoulders, locking eyes with men who barely raised their heads. "Rome does not break," he told them. "Not in fire, not in storm, not in the jaws of this cursed land. You carry the weight of every fallen legionnaire on your back, and you will not let that weight crush you. You will carry it out, together." The words sparked something, though faint, a flicker of defiance in tired eyes. But the enemy knew when to strike. By midday, as the column crossed another bridge patched with soaked timber, horns wailed again. Arrows hissed from the trees. Wagons splintered. Horses screamed. The Germans came in waves, never full force, but enough to keep the column bleeding. The rear guard staggered under assault, the front stalled, and the middle threatened to collapse under the strain. Germanicus spurred his horse into the thick of it. Rain blinded him, mud lashed up his cloak, but his voice cut through like steel. "Form the wall. Raise the scutum. Forward." The legions obeyed, shields locking, pila bristling like a forest of iron. They pushed back with mechanical determination, driving the Germans into the trees. A counterattack, desperate but fierce, forced the enemy to fall away. Cheers rose, short, strained, but real. For the first time, it seemed hope might survive. That night, campfires burned brighter, defiance glowing in the storm. Soldiers told each other that the worst was past, that Arminius had been pushed back. Germanicus sat in his tent, maps spread before him, water dripping from the canvas above. He traced their path westward, whispering calculations to himself. If they pressed on, if the weather cleared, if the bridges held, perhaps. But as he leaned over the table, a voice entered the tent. It was Aulus Caecina, his seasoned legate, face grim. "General, we cannot carry the baggage any longer. The wagons sink, the roads collapse, and every cart ties us to the swamp. We must abandon them." Germanicus clenched his jaw. To leave behind supplies, loot, even wounded comrades. It was unthinkable for a Roman general. But to drag them forward meant doom. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the dripping rain. Finally, Germanicus spoke. "If we abandon them, we tell the men their suffering was for nothing. If we keep them, we risk every life. Tell me, Caecina, what choice is left to Rome?" The legate said nothing, because they both knew the answer. Outside, the forest whispered again. The Germans had not been defeated. They were waiting. And as thunder rolled across the sky, Germanicus felt the truth settle in his chest like a stone. This was no longer a campaign of vengeance. It was a trial of survival, and the price would be higher than any legionnaire yet imagined. The stage was set. The snake of Rome was coiled, bleeding, trapped between hunger for honor and the jaws of the swamp. All that remained was the strike that would decide whether it lived or was devoured whole. The dawn was gray, the kind of color that promised nothing but grief. Mist clung to the swamp like a burial shroud, and the air carried a chill that sank in a bone. The Roman column moved in silence, its once proud order reduced to a weary crawl. Men no longer sang marching songs. They muttered prayers, or nothing at all. Germanicus rode near the front, cloak plastered to his armor, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Every step of his horse echoed with the weight of decision. He had chosen to keep the baggage, chosen to carry Rome's honor on his back. But now honor felt like a millstone. The bridge ahead stretched long across the marsh, its wooden beams slick with rain. Soldiers began to cross, boots pounding a rhythm that sounded too fragile for the weight it bore. Then came the silence again, the same silence that had haunted Teutoburg, the silence every veteran knew. "Shields!" a centurion barked, but his warning drowned in the sudden scream of horns. The forest erupted. From both banks, Germans poured out like the forest itself had birthed them. Spears rained down. Arrows hissed. Axes swung into the wooden beams of the bridge, hacking with furious rhythm. The structure groaned, sagged, and with a crack like thunder, a section collapsed, plunging men and wagons into the black water below. Panic ripped through the column. The snake of Rome snapped in two. Soldiers on the far bank turned back, shouting orders lost in the roar of battle. Horses reared, carts toppled, and men clawed at the mud, trying to climb from the swamp as Germans descended upon them. Germanicus spurred forward. His sword flashed, his voice roared over the chaos. "Stand your ground. Form the wall. Rome does not drown here." The legions rallied. Shields locked, pila flew, and the line bristled with defiance. They fought like cornered wolves, their discipline clashing against the wild fury of tribesmen who knew every root and hollow of the swamp. For a heartbeat, Rome held. But then the storm returned. Rain fell in sheets, blinding eyes, drowning fires, turning the ground into rivers of sludge. Trumpets blared, but their notes twisted in the wind, indistinguishable from enemy horns. A horse broke loose, thrashing through the ranks, scattering soldiers who thought the line had been breached. Panic spread faster than steel. Arminius appeared then, not as a phantom, but as flesh and blood. His voice rose above the storm, calling his tribes to strike. Painted in ash, drenched in rain, he seemed less a man than the spirit of the forest itself, the living proof that Rome could bleed. His warriors answered with howls, surging forward. The Roman shield wall fractured. A wedge of Germans drove into the center, splitting cohorts apart. Men slipped in mud, shields torn from their arms, swords swallowed by muck. Others drowned under the weight of comrades as they fell into the swamp. Germanicus fought in the thick of it, his sword carving arcs of desperation. He saw faces he would never forget. A standard-bearer clutching the eagle of his legion as he was dragged down into the mire. A centurion screaming for his men to stand as arrows pinned him to the ground. A boy soldier sobbing as he swung blindly in the rain. "Forward!" Germanicus cried, though even he knew forward no longer existed. Then came the breaking point. The rear guard collapsed under a sudden surge. Germanic warriors cut through the baggage train, setting fire to wagons, cutting down wounded, seizing spoils. Smoke joined the storm, a black pillar rising above the swamp. The serpent of Rome, stretched and bleeding, writhed its last. Germanicus' horse was struck, throwing him into the mud. For a heartbeat, he lay there, face pressed to the earth, water filling his mouth, the weight of failure pressing heavier than the storm. He thought of Augustus banging his head against palace walls, of Varus' broken body, of Rome's endless hunger for glory. And then he rose. Mud-caked, sword clenched, voice raw, he dragged himself to the shattered line. "With me," he roared, rallying the remnants. His men, bloodied and broken, followed, not out of hope, but because he refused to die on his knees. They charged, not for victory, but for survival. Through mud, through rain, through the screaming jaws of the forest, they carved a path of desperation. Every step cost lives, but every step carried them closer to escape. By nightfall, the swamp was a grave. Thousands of Romans lay among broken wagons and drowned bridges, their armor gleaming beneath the storm's fading light. The survivors, a fraction of the legion that had marched in, stumbled westward, leaving the dead to the silence of Germania. Arminius stood upon the ridge, watching. His face betrayed no triumph, only certainty. Rome had come to take vengeance. Instead, It had found another wound it would never heal. The survivors stumbled like shadows, their armor caked in mud, their eyes hollow from days without rest. They did not march as legions now. They limped as scattered men, clutching broken spears, dragging wounded comrades, glancing over shoulders at the forest that seemed always to breathe down their necks. The Rhine was still far, but to them it might as well have been the gates of heaven. Behind them, the Pontes Longi smoldered with the ruins of wagons and the drowned bodies of comrades. The swamp had swallowed their pride, their banners, and half their number. Germanicus rode among them, his face hard, unreadable. He had lived, but not unscarred. The rain had carved lines into his features, as though the storm itself had etched its memory into him. He carried not the pride of a general returning from conquest, but the silence of a man who had seen the abyss and barely pulled his men back from its teeth. When at last the remnants of a legions reached the safety of Roman fortresses along the Rhine, the gates opened with a groan that sounded like relief. Soldiers within looked on in shock. These were not the invincible legions of Rome. These were men who had stared into the forest and been broken by it. Whispers spread quickly, faster than any runner. Germania had bled Rome again. But in the quiet of his tent, away from the gaze of his men, Germanicus did not collapse. He sat, staring at a map, the ink of rivers and forests blurred where rain had seeped through the parchment. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. Should he abandon the land to its wolves, or return again and again, until Rome's name was carved into its soil? Caecina, his legate, entered. His armor was dented, his cloak torn, but his voice steady. "We survived, General. That is victory enough." Germanicus looked up, eyes burning with something sharper than defeat. "No," he said softly. "This is not victory. This is a lesson. The forest has shown us its cost. Rome must decide whether it is willing to pay it." Outside, the Rhine flowed, vast and indifferent, its waters carrying fragments of broken shields downstream. Beyond it, the forests of Germania stood untouched, their canopies dark and eternal, whispering with the songs of tribes who now believed they had tamed the empire itself. For Arminius, the victory was more than blood. Around fires in the villages, warriors sang of Longi. Children grew up hearing how the forest had swallowed Rome twice. The memory became legend, and legend became faith. Rome was no longer invincible. It was mortal, made of flesh, of fear, of blood that could be spilled. Yet Germania did not unite. Freedom was a bond too fragile to hold tribes together, and the forest was too wild to be ruled even by its liberator. Arminius himself would face betrayal, struck down not by Roman steel, but by rivals of his own blood. Victory in Germania was always fleeting, for even triumph could not tame the endless woods. And Rome? Rome endure. It always endured. The Senate raged, generals plotted, emperors dreamed of revenge. The wounds of Longi joined those of Teutoburg, scars etched into the empire's memory. But scars have a way of hardening flesh. The legions that survived learned the forest language, how to move lighter, how to fight ghosts and shadows, how to bend without breaking. The story did not end at Longi. It never truly ends, not while Rome still casts its shadow across the world. But for those who trudged through the mud, for those who watched friends vanish into swamps, for those who carried the screams of that storm in their ears until death, Germania would never be just a province. It would always be the graveyard where Rome's pride went to die. And yet, even graves can speak. Years later, when veterans sat in taverns or on porches, they did not boast of Parthia, nor of Egypt, nor of Gaul. They spoke of the forest, of the silence before the horns, of the sky that fell in rain and thunder, of the moment they realized Rome could falter. Their voices would lower, their eyes turning distant. And in that silence, one could almost hear the horns again, echoing through the centuries. Because some battles are never buried. They live on, not in stone or scroll, but in the hearts of those who remember. And Germania remembers.